the study of blood types, Rh factor is also called rhesus factor because it was first discovered in the blood of rhesus monkeys. There are 612 primate species and subspecies recognized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and not one has Rh negative blood. If mankind evolved from the same African ancestor, their blood would be compatible, but it's not. Nearly 85% of all human beings have Rh positive blood, yet all royal families have Rh negative blood. Where did the Rh negatives come from? Why does the body of an Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive child reject her own offspring? Nestled in the mountains between France and Spain, there is a semi-isolated population of native European people that have long puzzled anthropologists, linguists, and historians because although they are Caucasoid, they do not fit in with the rest of the European populations. Their language, for example, is distinctly unique in Europe and not related to any other Indo-European language. But that's not the only thing that's unique about the Basque. The Basque turned out to also be unique in terms of blood. Prior to the advent of genetic research tools, investigators used the ABO blood groups to study the relationships between human populations as well as their migration patterns. Each person's blood is one of four major types: A, B, AB, or O. Blood types are determined by the types of antigens on the blood cells. Antigens are proteins on the surface of blood cells that can cause a response from the immune system. The Rh factor is a type of protein on the surface of red blood cells. Most people are Rh positive. Those who do not have the Rh factor are Rh negative, which compromises about 15% of the world's population, but appears in much higher percentage among the Basque, which as a population contain among the highest levels of Rh negative blood in the world. The Basque people currently inhabit the area surrounding the Pyrenees Mountains, where Cro-Magnon man left behind some of his and her most famous artwork over 30,000 years ago. But exactly who are the Basque and where did they come from? I decided that a great place to find out is the University of Nevada, since it houses the Center for Basque Studies. This organization is primarily a research center that conducts and publishes on Basque-related topics such as anthropology, history, cultural studies, etc. Here's what they had to say about the Basque people and their origins, and this comes from their website's frequently asked questions. Question: where did the Basque come from? No one knows exactly where the Basque come from. Some say they have lived in the area since Cro-Magnon man first roamed Europe. Some say they are descended from the original Iberians. More fanciful theories exist as well. One is that the Basques are the descendants of the survivors of Atlantis. Question: where did the Basque language come from? Just as no one is sure about the origins of the Basques themselves, linguists are not in agreement over the origins of Euskara, the Basque language, either. When asked, I found that the majority of the Basque people themselves maintain that they came from Atlantica, a powerful maritime nation that sank into the Atlantic Ocean after a terrible cataclysm, and from which a few survivors reached the Bay of Biscay and the Pyrenees Mountains. This, they say, is not just mythology, but their true pre-European ancestry. There's another ancient people who claim racial lineage from the mythical Atlanteans. The Berbers are currently located geographically around Mount Atlas, but inhabit much of North Africa long before the Arabs arrived. The Berbers are considered the aboriginals of the area, and their origins beyond that are not officially known. Here we have a population, many of whom have blue eyes and light hair, living in northwest Africa of all places, and amongst some of the blonde tribes still living near the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the percentage of Rh negative blood can reach 40%. Now keep in mind, that's not the general national average, but restricted to certain local tribes. Anthropologists, for the most part, dismissed them for many years because they didn't fit well with the out-of-Africa paradigm. So it was presumed that they had migrated from somewhere in Europe. However, that theory has been abandoned with the current understanding of genetics. Scientists now accept the genetic evidence that concludes Berbers are an indigenous people, which they believe are descended from native Upper Paleolithic Cro-Magnon types going straight back into the Pleistocene or Ice Age. This should make it easier to understand why the oldest remains found in Egypt, nicknamed Ginger, and currently on display in the British Museum, has naturally red hair. This is pre-dynastic, which means before the pharaohs and before the accepted dating of the pyramids. I can go on for quite some time about blonde and red-headed mummies and blue-eyed statues, but I'll save that for a future video on ancient Egypt. For now, let us turn to another population native to an island off of the African coast who also left mummies and pyramids. The Guanches were very tall, powerfully built, blonde and red-haired indigenous natives of the Canary Islands, specifically the island of Tenerife. To date, there is still no evidence that the Guanches had any knowledge of maritime technology, which begs the question, how did they get there? This isolation allowed the Guanche to maintain a racial exclusivity until the time of the Spanish conquest. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, concerning the ethnic origins and racial identity of the Canary Island Guanches, and I quote, "The Guanches are thought to have been of Cro-Magnon origin, with blue or gray eyes and blondish hair." Madame Blavatsky, foundress of the Theosophical Society, points out that the genetic relations between these three populations, well over 100 years before our modern understanding of DNA, and I quote, she says, "If then the Basque and Cro-Magnon cavemen are of the same race as the Canaries Guanches, it follows that the former are also allied to the Aborigines of America. The Atlantean affinities of the three types becomes patent."
I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous, and this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, "Dear Mr. Pi, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerians said, and a male person from elsewhere, as I also contend. He goes on to say, what the evolutionists do is find certain genes which look very similar between man and ape, then they make a tree of descent while ignoring those huge impassable abysses of difference elsewhere. Also, by certain methods of DNA dating, one can tell that numerous genes have been recently added to the human genome. If workers in my field were to say such things openly, we would be ostracized, as I also contend, and forced to live in a tent. Any work along these lines would be rejected without any form of appeal. So what can we do? Sincerely, DNA Deep Throat.
Rh-negative genes are frequent in Europe, infrequent in Africa and West Asia, and virtually absent in East Asia and among the Aboriginal populations of Australia. By looking at Rh-negative blood type frequencies in different population demographics, it might become possible to identify a geographic origin. On a national level, Australia tops the percentage of Rh-negatives with 19%. Among some of the blonde tribes still living in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, called Berbers, that percentage is doubled to 40%. Now keep in mind, it's restricted to certain local tribes in Morocco. Another group with legitimate claims of the highest Rh-negative blood are the Basque of the Pyrenees Mountains, reported in different publications as having up to 32%, depending on location. The people of Northwest Ireland and the Western Islands of Norway all have between 16 and 25%, while the Lapps of Norway and Finland have around 7%. The frequency of Rh negatives in Scotland varies between the low number of 10% on the Moray coast to 30% Rh negatives in the Inverness regions of the West Coast. That said, there are many populations of Jewish people, such as the Jews of Iraq, which also rank amongst the densest Rh negative tribes in the world. Comprehensive studies of blood types in the Americas show that the Mayans, Incas, and natives of Chile have had 5 to 20% of the population being Rh negative. So what about other hominin, pre-modern human genomes that have been sequenced? Do we know the blood type, for example, of Neanderthal? The answer is yes, we do know, and no, Neanderthal is not Rh negative. Not only that, the Neanderthal specimen tested was not even a recessive carrier of the gene, which makes sense because East Asians have a much higher degree of Neanderthal genetics than Europeans, for example, and virtually no incidence of Rh negatives in their population, compared to Europeans, which have a very high degree. Rh negative blood arises in Cro-Magnon first, at the same time as domesticated animals show up, bow and arrows in the archaeological record, clothing, and many other attributes of civilization, including agriculture, which did not spontaneously pop up in different regions, but was spread or diffused by this same Cro-Magnon type people, which can help to explain why all royal families are of this haplotype. The term white supremacy is often attributed to a racist emotion or attitude by the media, but to an anthropologist, there is no civilization without agriculture, which allows for massive populations, armies, etc. And domesticated animals were a key reason for how agricultural civilization came about. For those of you that are not very anthropologically inclined, the biblical version of what I'm talking about is best explained in the Noah story, where Noah, having survived the rapidly melting glaciers and cataclysms at the end of the Ice Age, retained domesticated animals in Anatolia, such as horses and oxen, in his boat, spreading out during the Holocene from modern Turkey, where Mount Ararat is.
So both the Greeks and the Medes come from the Indo-European family. The Indo-Europeans stretch from the Indus River in northern India to the Black Sea, and eventually all the way to Ireland. They represent one of the three Caucasian groups. Traditionally, it was taught that there were three Caucasian groups, the first being the Hamite Caucasians, who became known as the Egyptians, the second being the Semite Caucasians, who became known as the Babylonians, Hebrews, Elamites, and Assyrians, and the third being the Great Indo-Europeans, or Japhites, also known as the Aryans, which included Northern Indians, Greeks, Medes, Latins, Celts, Germanic races, Slavs, and Russians, also known as Scythians. This was taught in schools, universities, and even in church. It's really in the last 150 years that we've seen a major change in the biblical story at the hands of globalization. We then have Noah's Ark landing on the Caucasian mountain on Mount Ararat. Noah's three sons and their sons dispersed in different directions from this point. So the old church tradition was that Noah and his sons were the white races. So Noah's sons and grandsons divided and eventually mixed with other people. And so Noah's sons represent the three Caucasian groups. Now, today, the churches teach the whole world was submerged underwater and that only 8 people survived. Therefore, we are all the product of serious incest, and somehow Noah and his wife gave birth to one pure African son, one pure white son, and one pure Asian son, and we're all somehow related. However, all DNA, all archaeology, linguistics, and even our modern world testifies that exactly where Noah's Ark landed is the exact starting point for the white race. But of course, this view is racist and the modern-day church view is more multicultural and therefore it's accepted. The Great Events from Great Historians, a collection from 1905, makes no apologies that Noah and his sons represent the 3 Caucasian groups, so this was a normal view in white Western Christian nations. Noah and his sons were Caucasian, hence why we call the mountains where Noah landed the Caucasian Mountains. The first three major empires after the flood were the Hittites in Anatolia, Egypt or Mizra, who comes from Ham's son Mizraim, and the Semites from Shem, who ruled Mesopotamia after a Semite named Sargon of Akkad conquered Mesopotamia. These kingdoms are recorded in secular history, and the Bible fully backs this up. So the Aryans or Indo-Europeans represent the Japhites, and in Greek mythology, two of the main gods who gave birth to all the gods were Gaia and Uranus, and they gave birth to a god named Iapetus or Japetus, who is also known as Japheth. He is one of the fathers of the Greeks. The Bible calls the Greeks Javan, who was a son of Japheth. If you go to your Bible concordance, you will see that under Javan it says Ionian Greek. When we look at language from India to Ireland, we see connections just through the words. In Sanskrit, which is Old Indo-Aryan and is the base for the Indian language today, we see similarities when we compare it with Old Persian, Latin, Greek, and even Gaelic. We see some serious connections. From Sanskrit to Old Persian, it's almost identical. Look at the words father, mother, and brother. Even when we compare it to German and English, even when we look at Gaelic, Greek, and Latin, we can see the Aryan roots. So even after thousands of years, we can still see similarities in the languages. Now, the first name of the Aryans' country was called Arata. It was in the mountains somewhere near Iran and Armenia, like the mountain Ararat, Arata, where the Bible says Noah's Ark landed and became the name Arya, Aryan, which in Sanskrit, Arya means noble or noble ones. Also, monotheism was apparently common among Aryans, who eventually invented Zoroastrianism. Now, Noah wasn't Jewish or Israeli or a Hebrew or a Semite. He was the father of all of them. The Bible tells us that the Phoenicians and the Israelites had trade posts with Javan, or the Ionian Greeks, and even Tarshish, which is in Spain. We know that they established the great city of Carthage, who conquered Spain, which Spain's original name was Iberia, which meant Hebrew, so it was originally called the Hebrew Peninsula. The Phoenicians had trade posts as far as Britain, Denmark, and potentially even the New World. The island in the middle of the Mediterranean bears the Hebrew words Sardania, which means rulers of Dan in Hebrew. The tribe of Dan were Viking-like people who had a habit of conquering lands and then renaming it after the father of their tribe, Dan.
Elisha was the son of Javan, the fourth son of Noah's son Japheth, according to the book of Genesis. The Jewish historian Josephus related the descendants of Elisha with the Elonians, one of the ancestral branches of the Greeks, or the ancestor of the Almanim. Alemannic German from the territory of Alemannia, which includes the Swabia region of Germany, is also called High German, another form being Yiddish, the historical language of the Ashkenazi Jews, a High German-based vernacular fused with elements taken from Hebrew and Arabic. While many people claim that history has been whitewashed, archaeological and genetic evidence shows that a large part of history is being painted black. The Queen of Sheba is one of the most elusive biblical characters of all. According to scriptures, the Queen of Sheba, whose real name remains disputed, voyages to Jerusalem to conduct a meeting with the wise King Solomon. Islamic folklore holds that the queen's name was Bilqis, and here she is depicted. Her arrival is overseen by a plenitude of servants. She also carries large quantities of gemstones, gold, and spices to the Israeli kingdom. According to a 14th century Ethiopian tomb, the Kebra Nagast, meaning the glory of kings, the Queen of Sheba was an ancient Ethiopian queen by the name of Makeda. She lived in the city of Aksum, the UNESCO protected ruins of which can nowadays be seen close to Ethiopia's northern border. Makeda would spend several months in Jerusalem, and before her departure home, Solomon invited her to sleep in the same part of his castle where his sleeping quarters were. However, both of them gave terms for such a sleeping arrangement. From Makeda's side, that Solomon would not approach to have intercourse with her. From Solomon's side, that the visiting queen would not take anything that belongs to him in their dormitories. These terms were broken, however. For dinner, Solomon asked his servants to prepare a dish that was very salty and spicy, and alongside Makeda's bed, water was placed for the evening, for when she wakes up thirsty for the dinner. When the queen indeed woke up and drank water from the bowl during the night, Solomon entered her chamber and indicated that his water had been taken. The product of the evening would be a male offspring. As Ethiopian tradition tells us, the child of Sheba and Solomon was Emperor Menelik I, the founder of the Solomonid dynasty. Menelik, who traveled to Jerusalem to see his father, is credited for obtaining the Ark of the Covenant and bringing it to Ethiopia, either as an endowment or as a theft. To this date, many Ethiopians consider that the biblical artifact can be found inside the chapel of the tablet that is next to the Church of Mariam Sion in Aksum. Replicas of the Ark can be found at other churches in the country too. The Kebra Nagast remains one of the most authentic and significant texts to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The text indeed names the alluring queen and pins down her lands as those belonging to ancient Ethiopia. Despite that, a great many contemporary scholars are confident that the Queen of Sheba was, in fact, a monarch of Yemeni province. That's just across the Red Sea on the Arabian Peninsula, and also brings us to the Quran interpretation of the story. An important aspect of why the Queen of Sheba would have come from Yemen is her name. About the time King Solomon reigned, which is around 970 to 931 BC, the ancient Ethiopian and Yemeni territories fell under the dominion of one dynasty. Its seat likely found in Yemen. This ancient kingdom was called Saba, and many historians interpret Saba as Sheba. The Quran names the kingdom's queen Bilqis. In this variant of the story, the two biblical characters never became intimate. Perhaps one day, archaeologists will stumble upon new evidence to shed light on the story. But the genetic evidence so far has yielded some interesting results. Researchers at the University of Cambridge have mapped out the earliest ever African genome from 4,500-year-old Ethiopia, and to their surprise, up to 1/4 of African DNA has come from interbreeding with Western Eurasians, such as people from Britain, Europe, and the west of Asia. Scientists believe that most of the interbreeding happened following a mysterious migratory event which occurred around 3,000 years ago, suggesting that large numbers of people moved into Africa to account for their presence in the DNA of modern Africans, accounting for around 1/3 of the population. According to Dr. Andrea Manica, senior author of the study from the University of Cambridge's Department of Zoology, and I quote, "Roughly speaking, the wave of West Eurasian migration into the Horn of Africa could have been as much as 30% of the population that already lived there, and that, to me, is mind-blowing." End quote. Archaeological evidence also shows the migration coincided with the arrival of Near Eastern crops into Africa, such as wheat and barley, suggesting the migrants helped develop new forms of agriculture in the region. The People's Republic of China, with a population of around 1.4 billion, is the world's most populous country, and the world's third or fourth largest country by area. With a rich and diverse history, the Chinese civilization has always shared common stories of blue-eyed deities who were the originators of Buddhism and the first leaders and organizers of Chinese society. While the majority of the population regards these stories as pure legend, there are villages in China with numerous residents that have blonde hair or blue and green eyes, and whose Caucasian features, such as a high nose bridge and beards, are prompting some historians to suspect that at least some of these ancient myths of the Far East might have a basis in truth. In 1912, two travel agents, Fred Meyer Schroeder and Oscar Maumann, reported seeing an unusually massive structure while exploring China. Documented in the book called Pyramids of China by Walter Hayne, the following description is translated from German. "It was more eerie than if we had found them in the wilderness. Here, they have been under the nose of the world, but unknown to Western countries. The largest pyramid is about 1,000 feet high and roughly 1,500 feet at the base, which makes it twice as large as the pyramid in Egypt. The four faces of the structure are oriented with the compass points." So not only do these two travelers claim that this Chinese pyramid was larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, it shared the same orientation as the Egyptian pyramids, being aligned the same way. During World War II, U.S. Air Force pilot James Gossman, along with his co-pilot, also reported seeing enormous pyramids while flying over China, while his aircraft was having technical difficulties, saying, quote, "I banked to avoid a mountain, and we came out over a level valley. Directly below was a gigantic white pyramid. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. It was encased in shimmering white. This could have been metal or some sort of stone. It was pure white on all sides. The remarkable thing was the capstone, a huge piece of jewel-like material that could have been crystal. There was no way we could have landed, although we wanted to. We were struck by the immensity of the thing." It seems this Great White Pyramid was also reported on by the New York Times on March 28, 1947, where in an interview with the newspaper, the former Far East director of Trans World Airlines, Maurice Sheehan, said 40 miles southwest of Xi'an, he had seen a gigantic pyramid. According to Sheehan, quote, "I was impressed by its perfect pyramidal form and its great size." 2 days later, on March 30th, 1947, the New York Sunday Times elaborated on the report, and this time also published the first photograph of the White Pyramid, which was taken in 1945 by James Gossman, the Air Force pilot that I mentioned earlier, and after that, no other stories were published. It wasn't until 1978 that New Zealand researcher Bruce L. Cathy pursued some clarification on the matter, uncovering correspondences between the Chinese embassy and the U.S. Air Force, and later publishing the photograph of the pyramid in his 1983 book called Bridge to Infinity. According to his findings, the pyramid did in fact have an estimated base of 1,500 feet and was 1,000 feet in height, with 4 trapezoidal-shaped sides, a square plateau on top, and a square base, like the pyramids of Egypt and Mexico. These Chinese structures seem to be completely unknown to the Western academia, and when brought up, denied as not being actual pyramids, but instead only pagodas, which are temple-like tiered towers, which are common to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and other parts of Asia. Most pagodas were built to have a religious function, most often Buddhist, but sometimes Taoist, and also built in ancient India. That said, the massive structures in China, which the communist government still tries to hide from satellites by planting rows of trees on them, are clearly pyramids. More people are starting to take notice of these enigmatic structures all over China and wondering about the ancient culture that must have erected them. An article published this week in The Express is titled, "China's Mysterious 8,000-Year-Old Structure Guarded by Military Could Hold Key Secrets." Goes on to say that China has a number of mysterious pyramids hidden in the overgrown countryside, reportedly guarded by the military to prevent them from being probed. But experts think they could hold keys to understanding more about the country's ancient history. More than 100 kilometers outside the ancient city of Xi'an, among the overgrown forest, rise scores of pyramid-shaped mounds that have been shrouded in mystery for thousands of years. The article mentions a German investigator named Hartwig Hausdorff, who set out to find the pyramids in the 1990s, but was unsuccessful, and instead found the Chinese military meticulously patrolling the area. Today, Google Earth will show anyone with the right coordinates evidence of not just one, but around 40 known pyramids. But not all are easily distinguishable to the human eye, as they are camouflaged with shrubs, bushes, trees, and even crops. According to the article, this region, in essence, is China's version of both Egypt's Giza and the Valley of the Kings in one, particularly because there's a huge amount of royalty rumored to be beneath the surface that no one has disturbed. One reason for the secrecy could be the fact that many of the ancient Chinese legends describe the early emperors with Caucasian features, which was reinforced by discoveries inside the first emperor's tomb, which predates the formal opening of the Silk Road, including European-specific mitochondrial DNA. Of course, this is in addition to the 4,000-year-old blonde Aryan mummies that have been discovered in China, some that have measured 6 foot 6 inches in height, found with swastikas etched onto their ancient artifacts, and DNA which speaks to their Aryan lineage.
It is important through genetics to figure out where people came from because they don't look like they belong. That is a funny way of saying it because they were there, they lived there, and they did belong. But we have, as modern human beings, a preconceived notion about how the world should look like. Well, the mummies from China don't look like they should be in China. They look like they should be in Denmark or Ireland or northern Germany because they look like people from over there. So what are these guys doing so many hundreds, thousands of miles to the east? DNA steps up to the plate, and they can tell us where they came from. Archaeology steps up to the plate and says when they may have come over. Combine the two, you got the family history and the kit and caboodle that they lived in. What are these people doing there? So long ago, well before the opening of the Silk Road, which is dated to 138 BC, these mummies date back, some of them, to 2000 BC. We are, in our bodies, the carrier of an archive, a genetic archive. It tells, if you were to study me, where I'm from, and if I studied you, where you're from. And there's no lying about it. In your books, you might say you're from another place, but your genetics will tell us exactly where you're from. We all carry in us, males and females, DNA that comes from our maternal line, through our mothers and grandmothers. So why is that important? For starters, it allows people who study that aspect of genetics in any individual to retrace the history of that particular person through the mother's lineage. The female mummies were mostly of local origin. However, there's another type of testing, the Y chromosome testing, which is the male line. The males came from parts further west, not necessarily Ireland, but places like Iran, maybe towards parts of Turkey. The mom's side and the grandmother's side is from the Tarim Basin, and the father's and the grandfather's side were moving in with their sheep, with their herds, slowly but surely, and having families, living their daily lives. So that is an additional aspect that the archaeological part to some extent corroborates, but doesn't tell in that great a detail. And that's the wonderful thing about DNA testing.
Although the information has been suppressed, alternative explanations to the communist version of Chinese history has been available for some time. As early as the 17th century, a Roman Jesuit wrote about the Chinese pyramids, and in 1785, the French Orientalist Joseph de Gignes wrote an article called An Essay in Which We Prove the Chinese Are an Egyptian Colony. Keep in mind that in this context, Egyptian does not mean the modern Islamic civilization and demographic that occupies North Africa in modern times, which is very different culturally, ethnically, and genetically from the ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids in ancient times. Despite widespread Afrocentric propaganda in the United States and European academia and media, the ancient Egyptian nobility, pharaohs, and mummies are predominantly comprised of red-headed and blonde Caucasian people, as can be attested to by the mummies themselves, which not only have Caucasian facial features, such as the high nose bridge, cheekbones, and lack of prognathism, meaning how far the mouth sticks out from the face, which any real anthropologist can visually distinguish from sub-Saharan phenotypes. But the DNA also shares affinities with Aryan or Western European genetics, depending on the period. Even the oldest remains found in Egypt, which date back to pre-dynastic times, which is now in the British Museum, nicknamed Ginger because of its red hair. So it's not only China that is hiding its true history, it's also the West that is guilty of teaching falsehoods in an effort to push a cultural Marxist political agenda. That said, Western archaeologists who are interested in learning the truth have, to this day, rarely been permitted to investigate the sites, and some have claimed photos show shrubs and even structures that have been deliberately planted or erected to keep the secret under wraps. Some archaeologists suspect that there are almost certainly lost emperors, treasures, and priceless artifacts buried below the mounds that would dwarf Howard Carter's 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun. In 1974, the world got a peek of a truly extraordinary history of China when two farmers were digging just outside Xi'an and discovered the famous terracotta army of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. There were legends that he had been buried inside a veritable mini-city with palaces, carriages, treasures, and anything else he'd need in the afterlife. Of course, 45 years later, the inner chambers have yet to be excavated, and the emperor himself has not been officially found, probably because, as I've stated earlier, DNA remains found on the site came back Caucasian, and the communist regime seems unwilling to confront the possibility that the ancient Chinese legends of blue-eyed gods and nobility might be true, similar to the blue-eyed statues of the Sumerian gods and nobility, and the many blue-eyed statues of the ancient Egyptian god kings and pharaohs. And even the blue-eyed artifacts and mummies found all the way in ancient Peru, so they prefer to delay archaeology at the site instead. Archaeologist Kristen Romy told Live Science that researchers are going to, quote, be digging there for centuries. Chinese communist authorities will not allow anyone to excavate at the site, and Xi Jinping's government says that the technology does not exist yet to properly explore the site. So, as long as the current political situation holds up, I think she might be right. Some have claimed that the Chinese have a strong veneration of culture, meaning that they simply wish to leave their royalty at peace. But I personally don't buy that argument, seeing how China has placed millions of Caucasian Uyghurs into concentration camps, and is tearing down Aryan Buddhist statues and rewriting the Bible to reflect a more socialist ideology. I don't believe the communist Chinese are motivated by peace, but like the radical left in the United States, they're systematically erasing and replacing history in an effort to impose a banker-financed, UN-backed, globalist, egalitarian political agenda, similar to what happened with the communist Bolshevik takeover of Russia, which has all but erased the memory of the Tartarian Empire that preceded it, or the Afrocentric communist destruction of South Africa, which is currently imposing a racially motivated genocide against the people that established agricultural civilization there over 500 years ago.
Oh!